Okay, so just so everybody knows, I am going to be recording this. So I opened up a YouTube space on so you can see the replay, or if you have people that you know that want to watch these, it will be out on YouTube. And Stephanie I sent her the link to it, and she can send that link out if you're interested or you want to pass it on to somebody else. So I will be recording this. So the program we're going to talk about today is called the inflammation connection. And the thing that I think people often miss is that there is a big connection between what you eat and inflammation. In fact, diet's the #1 contributor to inflammation. If there's one thing you could do to decrease inflammation, it would be change your diet. None of us eat a perfect diet, including myself. I do a pretty good job most of the time, but I do eat ice cream once in a while. It has some sugar in it. And I do have a couple of things that I like to eat. So none of us are perfect, but really the goal is to move on toward perfection, right? And so just making a better choice today than you made yesterday can make a big difference. So we're going to talk about some of the factors that play into what makes a diet more inflammatory and what you can do to be less inflammatory through your diet changes. So I want you to know you don't have to implement every one of these changes, but if you can pick one and start there, then that you get that one under control, then pick another one and do that one and just move on as you go. And if there's only 2 or 3 of these things that you say, that's all I want to do, then just do 2 or 3. It's better than none. Okay. So this first little cartoon is kind of hard to see, so I apologize for the smallness of these, but there were so many slides. If I'd done them one per page, you'd have had a book. But what this says, you've got a farmer there. He's got his farmer hat on and his farmer overalls, and it's the pharmacy that's spelled with an F. And he tells the lady, take one a day with tomato and cucumber. And so, I would contend that health does not start with the pharmacy, it starts with the farm. And that is what you eat. So, hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
So really important stuff here. The funny thing about this is, if you can see my car out here, my license plate says farmer, but it's with a PH. We live on a farm and I'm a pharmacist. So I have the flip side of this sign. So, okay. So what is inflammation? We need inflammation. We need it to all sorts of natural things in the body, protect ourselves from infection, to help us with healing. If we fall and turn our ankle, and it gets all swollen up and full of fluid, that's a body's natural inflammatory response to help stabilize that joint that's maybe been weakened by tearing something or pulling it, stretching it so that it's not very stable anymore. All that stuff that rushes there, you probably know if you turn your ankle, it gets really stiff, right? And that's for a reason. It's a protection. So it's when our immune system detects something foreign or there's some damage going on that needs to be healed. So fever is an example of a whole body inflammatory response. And our response to fever has really changed over the years. It used to be, oh, any fever at all, you want to treat it, bring it down. You don't want any fever. And now what they say is that if the fever is not uncomfortable, don't treat it. Because what's happening is the body's detected something foreign. It raises the body temperature to try to make a more inhospitable environment for that pathogen. So it makes it harder for it to survive. And if you suppress that fever, it's making it a lot easier for that bacteria or that virus to survive. So the fever response is helping you. And if you suppress it, you're actually working against your body's natural inflammatory response. So if you're having chills and achy because your fever's high, you do need to take something to bring it down. We don't want fevers going 104, 105. That's too high. But, if you're 100, 101 and you're not feeling particularly bad because of it, just let it go. Just leave it be what it is. So different types of inflammation. I have some pictures here that show some more obvious signs of inflammation, because we do have obvious inflammation, things like arthritis. You see in this picture, this woman has very deformed joints, probably very stiff fingers from it. It's very obvious. Asthma, somebody can't breathe, that's pretty obvious. Allergies, people are sneezing, runny nose, watery eyes, that's pretty obvious. But there's also not obvious, like heart disease, Alzheimer's. The one thing I know about cancer is that it thrives in an inflammatory environment. So that's the #1 thing we can do to battle it. But if you're inflamed, you're setting yourself up to be at a higher risk to getting cancer. So just, you hear about people who heal themselves by just changing their diet. Well, maybe it was all because they were so inflamed that the cancer took hold. And then when they changed their diet, it really just made for a less hospitable environment for the cancer cells. So we also have productive versus not productive. And I already mentioned fever is an example of a productive inflammatory response. It has serving a purpose, but I don't know what the purpose would be if you've got joint pain from arthritis, or if you have allergies. Why could there possibly a purpose for your nose running all the time and your eyes watering and you're sneezing? So, some are very helpful, some are just kind of an annoyance. Some inflammation is a good thing. We do need it, but too much is where we get into a problem. We have too much inflammation. So this is a short list of some diseases of inflammation here. And some of these, for instance, obesity, we don't really know whether inflammation comes first and then people hold on to their weight, or whether because people are gaining weight that they become inflamed. So we don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg, but what we know is that they go together. So if you're overweight, you're probably inflamed, and if you're inflamed, you're more likely to be overweight as well. So autoimmune disease is an example. There's a whole list. I think there's 200 autoimmune diseases last I saw for count. Is just an example of a disease in which the immune system is in hyperdrive. It's just in way overdrive. And so our goal with that kind of disease is to bring down inflammation. And of course, dietary changes are a big part of that. So when I work with people one-on-one, I almost always ask if they're open to diet changes before they commit to spending the money. Because if they're not opening to change their diet, there's probably not much point in working with me, because I am going to ask you to make some diet changes almost always. So. Okay, here's a short list too of some symptoms of excessive inflammation: fatigue, which is a very general, non-specific kind of thing; stiffness of joints; cholesterol being up; blood pressure up; depression. In fact, there's some newer research saying depression is really just inflammation of the brain, and we're treating it all wrong by managing and manipulating neurotransmitters. Some people respond to that, but a lot of people do not. And so if we can bring down inflammation, sometimes we can see depression get better. Digestive diseases, joint replacement, osteoporosis, macular degeneration. I mean, there's just a lot of them. This is kind of a short list again. So it's very common in Western cultures, when we have the Western diet, to have a lot of inflammation problems and diseases of inflammation. And I like to think about these two complementary channels in the body as being like railroad tracks that run parallel to each other. We have a pro-inflammatory channel and we have an anti-inflammatory channel. And what happens is we have these parent compounds that we take in our diet, that we have enzymes in the body that convert these fats down through the process down to what we call the children. And so when we need inflammation, we need to mount an inflammatory response. We have this cascade on the pro-inflammatory side that just proceeds, based on chemical messengers in the body, and we make arachidonic acid and a whole bunch of other things that help bring about the inflammation that we need to fight whatever it is. Pro-inflammatory side, we have things we get in our diet that get fed down through this channel. The thing that's interesting in these two railroad tracks, they use the same enzymes. And so if you've got a lot of inflammation in your diet, you're taking in lots of foods that are inflammatory, it's hogging all the enzymes over on this side, and you don't have a lot for the anti-inflammatory side. So you may be taking some things in your diet, but they're not getting converted down through the process, so that we end up with these children that we need, that like EPA and DHA, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, which are some different kinds of fats. So the pro-inflammatory side promotes inflammation. The anti-inflammatory side discourages or helps to squelch the inflammation. So the cells in the body produce these pro or anti-inflammatory chemicals using nutrients from the food we eat, and that's why diet is a big contributor to inflammation. So it's primarily these fatty acids. We call them omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And so I'm going to talk about those in more detail here in just a minute. I already mentioned food is the most important factor in fighting inflammation, but there are a number of factors that help determine whether the food's going to be pro or anti. And I'm going to talk about those here. So the factors are type and amount of fat, and the amount matters, but the type matters even more. So I'll give you an example, traditional versus grass-fed beef. People say, oh, you shouldn't eat a lot of red meat because it causes heart disease, it causes, all kinds of diseases. Well, a lot of the research shows that you can eat a small amount of traditionally raised beef, which is fed what? What do we feed cows? Most of them aren't eating grass, but corn and soybeans, right? And you're going to see in a minute, corn and soybeans are highly inflammatory. And so if we're feeding the cows corn and soybeans, which are pro-inflammatory, Michael Pollan says in his book, In Defense of Food, you are what you eat. So that means if it's not good for us and we're eating something that's eating it, it's probably not good for us to eat the beef either. So anyway, we've got traditional raised beef. We can eat a small amount and be not so healthy. We can eat a larger amount of pastured or grass-fed beef and be healthier, because it's based on the type of fat that's contained in the meat. And the fats are very different because of what the animal's been eating. Okay, I'm going to talk about that several times here. So we're talking about fish. Wild caught fish is going to be better than farm raised because of what it's fed. Chickens, eating eggs that are pastured is going to be a much better choice than just regular traditionally raised eggs because of what they're eating. Pastured cows, the butter, cheese, yogurt, if you do dairy from pastured cows, is going to be different because the fat content it has different fats in it, and they're going to just be more anti-inflammatory. So it's really the amount does matter, but the type matters so much more than the amount. So having things like olive oil and lower saturated fats in the diet can reduce inflammation and related diseases. Trans fatty acids, which are not around so much anymore, we've kind of had an awakening when it comes to these trans fatty acids. They've been mostly removed from foods, but they're not gone. In fact, I noticed there was a bag of chips I picked up here recently that said 0 grams of trans fats, but when you looked at the ingredients, it did have a hydrogenated oil of some sort in it. But according to the FDA, if it's less than 1 gram per serving, they can say it has none. So you really have to kind of look at the ingredients to see. Those are the worst. Death by trans fats is the worst. In fact, I remember telling my mom in 1996 that I'd rather die a natural death and eat butter than die from eating trans fatty acids. And she wanted to know what science fiction book I'd been reading. But anyway, so what's important about these fats, these omega-6, which are the more pro-inflammatory, and the 3s, which are the more anti, is the balance of these. Okay, so if you look in the middle of this slide, the balance is important. Ideally, we want a ratio of 6s to 3s. Now that seems counterintuitive because 6s are the ones that are more pro-inflammatory, but I also said we need them because we need to be able to mount an inflammatory response. So ideally, we want about 3 or 4 times more 6s than 3s. Okay, then they look at ancestral diets from thousands of years ago. Somehow they've been able to tell that that was kind of what their diets look like. Well, if you look at the current American diet, the standard American diet, it's about 30 or 40 to 1. So that's a 10-fold increase in the amount of 6s than what we really need. So if you know anything about math and we have a ratio that we want to change, we can do 2 things, right? We can either decrease the high one, or we can increase the low one, or we could do some of both. So in order to decrease the 6s, we can change our diet. That's really the only way to do it, is to not eat so much. And if you look here, the 2 types in our diet, the omega-6s are primarily seeds of plants. So rice, corn, soybean, wheat, all of those are seeds of the plant that are ground and made into flour, or we just eat them like oats. We would just eat the oat. So we can change our diet to bring the 6s down. That would change that ratio. We could also add a supplement or eat more foods that have 3s and bring up the 3s. So that's why I often use fish oil when I'm working with people that have inflammation, because that's a way to increase your 3 intake, right? Or we could do some of both. We could take, so I'll eat salmon twice a week, not farm raised, wild caught. And I'm going to decrease my intake of some of these seeds of plants, because the omega-3s come primarily from the leaves of plants. And that's why grass-fed beef, pastured chickens, pastured goats, wild-caught seafood is going to be less inflammatory, because it's eating the greens in the waterways like algae, and the animals are eating grasses, and with chickens they eat bugs too, which is going to be helpful. So too much omega-6 is going to feed the inflammatory pathway in our cells, and it starves the anti-inflammatory. And that is what I was talking about with these 2 pathways that run parallel, that they share the same enzymes. If you feed a lot of stuff into the omega-6 side, it starves the omega-3 side, because it takes all those enzymes and it prevents them from being converted into the helpful things that we need. Another one of the factors is glycemic index, and glycemic index has a bit fallen out of favor recently, but I think it still helps us sort of frame this in a way that's helpful, because this relates to how much sugar or how much a food affects your blood sugar. Okay. So glycemic index is basically just a measure of how that food affects your blood sugar. And they have given glucose, which is sugar, a value of 100, and then every other food is compared to that. So how much does it affect your blood sugar compared to eating sugar, glucose? So the higher the glycemic index, the more it affects your blood sugar. The one thing about this that makes it hard to use and not very applicable is that it's based on the amount of the food. So you can see I have like an orange has a glycemic index of 40. That's for one small orange. If you eat 2 small oranges, it's more than that. Okay. It's not 40. So it's based on a serving size. And so if your serving size is bigger, the effect on your blood sugar is going to be bigger, obviously. The thing about this that makes it so important when we're talking about inflammation is that when you start getting blood sugar spikes, which means you eat something that's going to drive up your blood sugar goes up, you release insulin to help take care of it, your blood sugar comes down, and then insulin comes down, and then you eat it again and your blood sugar goes up and insulin goes up. Well, if you're eating processed carbohydrates, so whether it's sugar, whether it's a bagel, whether it's whatever jam that has sugar in it, the more readily it's absorbed, the higher it goes, the quicker it goes, and then the faster it falls. And so if you're eating 10 times a day, which believe it or not, some studies show that the people eat the most times a day, eat on average 10 times a day over 14 hours. So think what's happening to their blood sugar. It goes up and it goes down. It goes up and down and up and down and up and down, because every time they eat, if they're eating something that affects their blood sugar, they get these blood sugar spikes. Well, that's what causes inflammation, is when that blood sugar goes up and it crashes and up and it crashes. So we want to really have a more gradual increase in our blood sugar, more sustained, and a more gradual drop off in our blood sugar to try to alleviate some of these spikes that can lead to more inflammation. So eating complex carbohydrates, if you're doing things like eating, whole rolled oats or steel cut oats instead of eating quick oats, that's going to make a difference in your blood sugar. So anyway, I've listed here also an apple has a glycemic index of about 39. So just to give you sort of an idea of how these, and you can look these up, you can Google what's the glycemic index of just about any food, and I think you probably will find something pretty readily. So amount of vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants that are in foods also helps to determine whether it's going to be more pro or anti-inflammatory. And one of the things that happens when we are inflamed is things in the body are formed that have a number of names: free radicals, reactive oxygen species, pro-oxidants. And these are things that tend to have some activity. They like to find something to latch onto. And when it latches onto something that is normal tissue, it can cause damage to that. And so that's why it's so important to have antioxidants. It gives something for these pro-oxidants to bind onto, so they are no longer reactive. And so they don't do as much damage. That's why it's so important to eat fruits and vegetables, because guess where you get antioxidants? It's fruits and vegetables. That's it. It's brightly colored things. So, I tell people, eat the rainbow, eat orange, red, blue, purple, green. Don't just eat green. Don't just eat iceberg lettuce. Say, oh, I eat my vegetables. I eat 9 cups of iceberg lettuce every day. You need to eat some other colors, okay? Get some variety, because all of those different colors are giving you all different antioxidants. And so it can be really helpful in minimizing the damage that comes about when you're inflamed. And we also know that people who have lower levels of antioxidants, things like vitamins C and E, selenium, beta carotene, also have higher levels of inflammation. So there is a connection. We aren't sure really if they're which comes first. Are they lower levels and then you have more inflammation, or you have more inflammation so the levels get lower? But in any case, getting plenty of these antioxidants can be very helpful in terms of counteracting some of this oxidative damage we have going on. Okay, method of preparation is another thing. This is sort of an easy thing, some easy things you can do in terms of preparing your food that can help decrease inflammation, because cooking method matters. And for those of you that are big grillers, I'm sorry, I have some kind of bad news for you. I do have some suggestions. The grilling is probably one of the worst things you can do in cooking meat and vegetables because of the temperature, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But what can happen if you cook things in a harsh way, and sometimes during processing, is something can be formed that we call advanced glycation end products. A long sort of phrase that we abbreviate AGEs. which interestingly, AGEs make you age faster. Isn't that interesting? It's one of the things that causes you to age faster. So not only does it do that, but it promotes the development of heart disease, increases inflammation, promotes complications of diabetes. And for any of you who are maybe familiar with how we monitor diabetes these days, it's through something called hemoglobin A1C. And what we're looking at when we measure that is a sort of a 3-month rolling average of what your blood sugars have done. So you can't just be good the 2 days before you go get your blood drawn if you're going to have an A1C drawn, because it's a 3-month average. So if you've been terrible for 2.5 months, you can't fix it 2 weeks before you go get your blood drawn. You cannot lie that way. But what we're monitoring here is glycated hemoglobin. Okay, so glycated, you just heard that, right? Advanced glycation end products. So hemoglobin that's been glycated is damaged hemoglobin from high blood sugar. It's a measure of how damaged your hemoglobin is, because hemoglobin A1C is a percent, right? Normal is under 5.5% of your hemoglobin is glycated. And it's normal to have some. I mean, we can't have 0. I mean, we have inflammation just walking around breathing. But we don't want it to be high. And people that have diabetes sometimes have 10, 11, 12% of their hemoglobin is glycated. That tells us they have lots of high blood sugars and lots of damaged or glycated hemoglobin. So this is a good example of something we measure in the body that's an advanced glycation end product as a result of having high blood sugars. So one of the things I want you to just keep in the back of your mind here, I have at the last point here, the content of a typical diet for AGE content is around 16,000 kilounits per day. Because I'm going to give you some tables here in a minute that show you the difference in preparation of different foods and how it affects the AGE content. And I'm going to tell you how to minimize it here in just a minute. The first thing you can do, and one of the most important factors, is cooking temperature. And using higher temperatures, you produce more AGEs. Okay, so higher temperatures you find with pan searing, oven frying, grilling. Those are going to be higher temperatures. Flash searing, like if you go to McDonald's, you get a hamburger really fast, right? Because they use a really high temperature, they flash sear it, and it's done lickety split. So fixing a hamburger at home is probably not that way, because you're just putting it in a pan, probably not as high temperature, and you're not usually in a big hurry. So one of the suggestions I have for grilling, for those of you who like to grill, you can't do this with steak, you can't do it with hamburgers, but things like brats, hot dogs, which I hope most of you don't eat hot dogs too often, and turkey tenders, chicken breasts, those kinds of things. What I suggest is to boil them first till they're 1/2 or 2/3 done, and then go put them on the grill for the last few minutes, and you can put your sauce, your seasonings, and finish them up that way. So you're minimizing the amount of time that's exposed to these high temperatures. And the other thing that you'll see here is that moisture has a big impact on how much AGEs are formed. And so cooking them in water can decrease the binding of the sugars to the proteins and fats. And you can decrease these by up to 50% just using water. So think about how my grandmother used to prepare Sunday meals. She'd put a roast in a Dutch oven with water, and she'd put carrots and onions and potatoes, put the lid on, put in the oven. We'd go to church and come home and it would be ready, right, for lunch. That is the way we need to get back to cooking, is using moisture when we're cooking. Primarily meats we're talking about, not always, but a lot of it's eggs and meat products. So, using things like broth, salsa, even, just plain old water, of course, but you can use other things. It doesn't have to just be water. So, hi, are you here for the program? No. Oh, you're here for an appointment? Okay, so some preferred cooking methods then that are going to use moisture include boiling, stewing, and poaching. So once I found this out, I used to do a lot of scrambled eggs, and I still do some, but I switched over more to doing poached eggs, because guess what? They're cooked in water, right? So when we go eat at Hy-Vee for breakfast, I always get my eggs poached, and they don't like that because they have to boil the water and it takes longer, but that's okay. So, hard-boiled eggs, soft-boiled eggs, poached eggs, you're going to have moisture there. Any of your like stewing things. So if you're going to do a stew, just make sure there's plenty of moisture in there. So yeah, those are going to be some things that are also going to decrease the formation. And the last one is cooking time. The last big factor is cooking time. So the longer you cook things, the more AGEs are formed. And so if you're going to do something in a crock pot, I mean, there you go with a lower temperature, right? Because crock pots, you can set it on low, but for it to cook 8 hours, the longer it cooks. So there's a trade-off here. If you're going to use a lower temperature, you're going to have to cook longer, right? I mean, that's just the way it works. So it's not an even trade-off, though. It's better to use a lower temperature and cook longer. But I do say, if you can help it, don't cook longer than you need to. So if you can put your stuff in the crock pot at noon and take it out at 5 and it's done, don't put it in at 7 and take it out at 5. If you can, if it's possible. If you're not home all day, then you do what you have to do. But not cooking any longer than you have to is also helpful. And there is a final a factor here, cooking environment, that I say this is a little bit less important. I guess I said that was the last one, but this is really the last one. Cooking in an acidic environment can be very helpful in decreasing AGE formation. So marinating things, my favorite marinade, I use it all the time if we're going to grill, is for chicken, like chicken parts or turkey breasts or tenders, is to use equal parts lemon juice and balsamic vinegar. It makes a lot of really great flavor. And it's acidic. Both of those things are acidic. And so you get a nice acidic environment. You could use salsa or tomato juice because that's also going to be pretty acidic. Orange juice. I have a recipe for a crock pot chicken that uses orange juice. And I think there might be a little pineapple juice. It's kind of a Hawaiian something or other. So finding ways that you can use acidic liquids when you're cooking, and especially for marinating too, it makes a nice flavor. So just to summarize here, the recommendations to decrease AGE formation: use brief applications of heat, cook with water or moisture, eat fresh foods, fruits and vegetables. You can always eat some of those fresh. Use lower temperatures and cook in an acidic environment are all going to be helpful. So there's a couple tables here that show you the different ways you can prepare foods and have how it affects the AGE formation. And this information came from an article that came out in the American Dietetic Association journal some years ago. If anyone's interested in the whole article, I will send it to you if you'll email me. It has probably about 10 or 12 pages at the back that are just tables of these different foods and how you can prepare them and how it affects the AGE content. So it's kind of like just a reference at the back. And that's where most of this information came from on AGEs. But if you look, this is a piece of chicken, a 3-ounce piece of chicken, which is a nice sort of recommended size piece of meat. If you oven fry the chicken, which usually is done at really high temperatures, 475 or 500, it's about 9,000 kilounits of AGEs. If you boil that same piece of meat, it's only 1,000 kilounits. Huge difference, right? A 9-fold decrease and the amount of AGEs that you get formed. And you can see some of these others in the middle here. Deep fried, no moisture when you're deep frying something, right? So it's going to be brief heat, but it's probably a pretty high heat. Broiling is going to also be a fairly high temperature, but it's not as high as oven fried. And then roasted would just be putting your chicken in the oven and putting it at 325 or 350 and cooking it till it's done. Here's another example, 3 ounces of potatoes. If you get fast food French fries, about 1,500 kilounits of AGEs. What would be the factors here that would play into that being high? What do you think? Temperature, right? Because they're cooked pretty fast. What else? No water. Yeah, because they're cooked in oil, right? They're dipped in a big vat of oil. So yeah, those two things are going to be are against it. If you make French fries at home, 694. If you make boiled potatoes instead of fried potatoes, look what it does. It's like almost 100-fold decrease in the amount of AGEs. If you just boil the potatoes, make mashed potatoes, or just have boiled potatoes and put a little oil or something on them after you're done. So it makes a really big difference. The difference I can think of in the homemade French fries is that you're not cooking them at such high temperatures and maybe more moisture. I don't know, but okay, I'm gonna just talk briefly about some inflammation lowering compounds. So when I work with people that have a lot of inflammation, I often will bring in some supplements or make some recommendations for an herb or something that might help. And fish oil is number one. It's right at the top of the list. And I already mentioned the why. It's because it contains these omega-3 fatty acids, which feeds that anti-inflammatory channel. And so that's what we want, is we want more stuff going down that side of our railroad tracks here. There are some spices and seasonings that can be anti-inflammatory. ginger, turmeric, garlic, peppers for most people. Some people do have problems with the nightshade family, which includes peppers. So not everybody does well with peppers. There are some anti-inflammatory plants too, stinging nettle and ginkgo biloba. And stinging nettle is often in products we use for natural products for allergies. So people that have like seasonal allergies, stinging nettles can be really helpful there. It just helps decrease inflammation, which that's what we got with allergies, right? Too much inflammation. So, and then there's an anti-inflammatory enzyme called bromelain that I have used, and bromelain, is found in pineapple, is usually where that comes from. And it's, we think of enzymes as being like digestive enzymes. I think a lot of people think of that. We have you take it on an empty stomach. And what I use it for is people who've had an injury or maybe surgery, and they get an accumulation of a lot of cellular debris in the area. So like, let's say you turn your ankle and it gets all swollen and eventually heals, but it's still kind of stiff and it's still not the same size that it was. It's maybe still kind of enlarged. It's because you get all those things, those inflammatory compounds rush to the area to try to help take care of the injury and the damage. And then some of that stuff just doesn't get absorbed very fast. It doesn't go away. And so this kind of an enzyme cleans up cellular debris. It helps break down this cellular debris that happens in the area of the inflammation. And so it sometimes can be helpful in restoring motion. I have somebody I worked with, one of the physical therapists in Cedar Rapids where I have used to go. She had some wrist surgery, fell off her bike, and she wanted to make sure she could get full use of that wrist back because she's really active and she's a physical therapist and she's always using it. And so she used some systemic enzymes right from the get-go after her surgery to try to keep that cellular debris from building up in the surgical site there in her wrist where she had the surgery. So it can be really helpful in those kinds of situations. So, okay, this is my contact information here. Feel free to email me, call me. I do have a website that has some information about what I do. And so with that, I would love to answer any questions anybody has about inflammation and diet. Yeah.
What about, you said cooking plays that part. What about air frying and microwaving?
Oh, good question. Air frying there's no moisture typically in air frying.
Right.
I don't have one, but I don't know what the temperature is. Anybody know what the temperatures get? Does it get really hot?
You just set it.
You can set it? Okay.
Basically, I think you're supposed to follow the oven's temperature when you're setting it.
Okay. All right. I would say it's probably not ideal just because there's no moisture in there. Because if you have moisture, it's probably going to get soggy, right?
And the air fryer,
yeah,
crisps things up. It does the opposite of what you think because it's that flow of air.
Right. But if you put water in there or moisture in there, yes, it would make things soggy. Yes.
Yeah.
And so that kind of defeats the purpose. So, I'm not saying don't use it, but I wouldn't probably do it every day because it's higher temperatures, maybe no moisture. So the no moisture thing is probably the biggest. But like I said, we still grill, even though grilling's not ideal. So it's really just a matter of being aware that this might not be ideal. Don't do all your vegetables breaded and air fried,
right?
Sort of thing.
And
microwaving, I've seen some studies that show that microwaving is actually a good way to preserve a lot of the nutrients in vegetables, for instance. Like these steam in the bag is actually not a bad thing, I think, because when you cook them in a pan with water, you lose a lot of the nutrients into the water. In fact, I know people that are real purists, they keep all their water that they cook vegetables in and they save it and they use it for soup. Because they want to capture all those nutrients again. With microwaving, you don't really have that happen. You aren't losing all those nutrients. So meat is something that I've seen, they don't recommend that you microwave meat to cook it, reheat maybe, but not put your meat in there, your Thanksgiving turkey and cook your turkey in a microwave. Yeah, because it does alter proteins in meats. But with vegetables, I've seen that it is actually a fairly beneficial way to cook them. Yeah.
So a pressure cooker is something that cooks faster, very high pressure, high heat, probably not recommended.
Like an Instant Pot?
Yeah.
I think Instant Pots are not bad because there's moisture.
Yeah.
It's not a super high temperature, but it does get hot, but it's pressure. And it's the pressure, when that closes off, that's what makes things cook fast because it forces the moisture inside and the heat inside the food. So it cooks faster. So that's shorter cooking time. There's moisture because if you don't have moisture, it won't cook right. It doesn't seal right.
Right.
In fact, I tried something once and there wasn't enough moisture and it never did seal. It's like, whoops. So I think Instant Pots are actually not a bad choice at all. Yeah.
I know fish oil, you have some recommendations
Mhm.
on quality and what to look for as far as the units. of it.
Yes, I do. Fish oil. There are lots and lots of choices out there. And what I'll say is that there are two forms to be aware of. Make it simple. One's more expensive than the other. One's called an ethyl ester form. The other's called the triglyceride form. What happens is that let me go back here to where you can actually see me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So can you guys on Zoom, can you see me? I guess everybody's muted.
I can see you and I'm on Zoom.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So what you get with fish oil, they're triglycerides. So you have this glycerol backbone and you have 3 fatty acid chains attached. Well, when they process it, they rip off this glycerol backbone, they purify it, concentrate it. And then with the ethyl ester form, you get this. You get these fatty chains and they have more of a fishy taste and smell. They're cheaper. With the triglyceride form, they put this backbone back on again. And it's the natural form. It's how it occurs in nature. So it is more expensive, but it has less fishy taste and smell. And we do see higher blood levels with the triglyceride form. So I recommend, especially if you've had problems with fish burps with fish, it's probably because you've used the ethyl ester form. And for anybody who's done my online assessment, that's one of the questions is, did you have fish burps? Because we used to actually carry where I worked an ethyl ester form because it was cheaper for people that wanted that. So I recommend that you use a high quality fish oil product because I know somebody who works for Nordic Naturals and they are the premier fish oil company in the world. They control their product from cradle to grave. They test, I think it's 82 times from the time, all through the process to make sure it's not oxidized, it's not contaminated, because it is really easy. It's an oil and it has a really short shelf life. It gets rancid very quickly. All the omega-3s do. That's why flax oil has to be kept in the fridge. It's why flax meal needs to be kept in the freezer because they get rancid really quickly. So some of these cheaper products can be oxidized and that's partly why you get this fish burps. And the other thing is some of these products are really low potency. When you go and take something off the shelf, the labels are really misleading. It might say triple potency, 1200 milligrams. But when you flip the bottle around and look at the EPA and the DHA amount, which is what we're interested in, those are the two children. Remember, I talked about the parents and the children. EPA and DHA are the children on the omega-3 side. Sometimes there's only 250 milligrams of them when you add them together. And that's what we want. Add those together, divide it by the serving size, and that's how much is per capsule. I use products that are between 820 and 1,000 milligrams per capsule. You can get them easily that are 150, 200, 250 milligrams per capsule. So if you want to use the cheaper product, you're going to have to take 8 of them versus 2 of mine. So the cost difference goes away pretty quickly to get a therapeutic dose. So yeah.
The daily recommendation for units.
The daily recommendation, if you don't have a ton of inflammation, is 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams when you add the EP and the DHA together. If you have a lot of inflammation, like rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune disease, gut inflammation, I usually do people at about, 8, 20, 16, about 3,000 milligrams-ish per day for at least a month to kind of get them over the hump. But all the studies done in rheumatoid arthritis were done at 3 to 4 grams a day, which is a pretty good dose, pretty hefty dose.
3 to 4 grams is 3,000 milligrams to
Mhm.
4,000.
Yes, correct. Yep. I wouldn't recommend doing that high of a dose unless you work with somebody who can tell you if that's appropriate. I often will start people at that for a month and then have them drop down to that 1,500 to 2,000, just because that's enough for most people.
So you put a load in and then once the load's gotten in there, then you.
Yeah. Yes, and the reason for that is because I remember I said that what you take in gets taken up into your cells and incorporated into our tissues. And so we want to get, every cell in our body has a fatty membrane, a lipid membrane. And what that membrane is made up of is the kinds of fats we take in our diet. And so if we're taking in lots of 6s, those membranes get really rigid and sticky, kind of like earwax. Anybody ever know anyone that has earwax problems where it's all dark and sticky and you have to get it flushed out? That is a deficiency of an omega-3 fatty acid. That's what your cells look like when you don't get enough 3s. They're rigid and sticky. And that's why fish oil can work better than aspirin at keeping your blood less sticky. It doesn't thin your blood, it makes it less sticky because those membranes, when they have omega-3, are fluid and flowing and flexible. So things can flow better through vessels. You're going to have less chance of having a clot or a stroke. And it's why you bleed more easily when you're on fish oil, because your blood is just less sticky. So did that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Anybody on Zoom have any questions? Oh, somebody asked here, can you use pineapple or does it need to be fresh? It's not a problem to use canned pineapple, especially if some people get irritated mouth because of the enzymes. Canned pineapple isn't as irritating, but make sure it's packed in juice, not in syrup. Okay, so that's the one thing I would say about canned fruit. And then what do you use flaxseed and oils for? Well, flaxseed and oil, the flax oil is a source of omega-3. It's the parent on the omega-3 side. As humans, we don't convert very well. Animals do it really well. So that's why people say, oh, I'm taking flaxseed instead of fish oil. Well, you can't take it instead of fish oil. You can do it with fish oil if you want. I use flaxseed for fiber supplement. However, in women, it can cause hot flashes. So you need to be careful if you're in menopause. You can bring hot flashes back with a vengeance. I sometimes use it for just an omega-3 source in somebody that I usually start with fish oil, but sometimes if they don't respond, I might add flax oil because it's just a different omega-3. So it has it has some hormonal effects too. So, sometimes you can get some benefit that way if you're having some hormone stuff, but when menopausal women wouldn't be the category. Men, it's a great thing because it blocks the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. And that's why women end up at hot flashes, because they don't make as much estrogen. For men who want more testosterone, it's a great thing. So take flax, have flax meal for your fiber instead of Metamucil. It'll have some nice benefits, I think, for men. So other questions anybody has? Well, okay. I really appreciate everyone's attendance, and this will be posted. I'll send the link to Stephanie once I get it processed. And so that if you have anybody that you want to share it with, or if you want to go back and listen to it again, you can feel free to do that. The other thing I'll just mention is our program next month is, the topic offhand? Sleep. Okay. Stephanie and I are going to do this one together. She's going to talk about some of the sleep hygiene stuff. I'm going to talk about some of the nutritional / supplement things you can do to help with sleep if you're having sleep issues. So it'll be the same time, first Friday of April.
I think it's April 1st.
Yeah, April Fools. Ha ha. So, okay, well, thank you again. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions that come up later.